All right, everyone, we're going to open up with the topic. So we're going to do worldview definition, and we're going to do Christian worldview definition. A worldview is the framework from which we view reality and make sense of life and the world. It is any ideology, philosophy, theology, movement, or religion that provides an overarching approach to understanding God, the world, and man's relations to God and the world. And that was spoken by David Noah Bell, author of Understanding the Times. That's something that all of us would like to do. Understanding the times. For example, a 2-year-old believes he's the center of his world. A secular humanist believes that the material world is all that exists. And a Buddhist believes he can be liberated from suffering by self-purification. Now, someone with a biblical worldview believes his primary reason for existence is to love and serve God. Whether conscious or subconscious, every single person has some type of worldview. A personal worldview is a combination of all you believe to be true. And what you believe becomes the driving force behind every emotion, decision, and action. Therefore, it will ultimately affect your response to every area of life. From philosophy to science, theology, anthropology to economics, law, politics, art, and social order. Everything. What's a biblical worldview? Now, biblical worldview is based on the infallible word of God. When you believe the Bible in its entirety, in other words, that it is entirely true in nature, then you will allow it to be the foundation of everything you say and everything you do. Okay, let's look at science. So what is science? Well, the definition of science is that science is the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. In other words, a systematically organized body of knowledge on a particular subject. How does Christianity and science impact one another? That is the object of our discussion here. How does Christianity and science impact one another? Christian worldview versus science. When it comes to Christianity and science, perhaps nothing has troubled believers more in the last century than the question of the origin of life. Because many biologists, both Christian and non-Christian, treat evolution, evolution, as a scientific fact. Christians have struggled to reconcile their faith in the Bible with the facts of science. For example, the Bible states that God created our first parents, Adam and Eve, fully formed. Yet evolutionary science claims that all living things evolved from a single speck of life. A single speck of life. Now, because the positions of creation and evolution are poles apart, it seems that reconciliation is impossible. However, some Christians have proposed a middle ground, seeking to combine elements of both sides of the debate. This middle ground is called theistic evolution. Now, what is theistic evolution and how does it play a part in all of this? The belief, this is what theistic evolution is. The belief that God created the first speck of life on earth and then directed its evolution to generate man is called theistic evolution. To hold this position, Christians must take substantial liberties in interpreting the Bible. They also face most of the same weaknesses as proponents of atheistic evolution. In truth, there is no difference between theistic and atheistic evolution, except that theistic evolutionists argue that God used evolution to generate the diversity of life throughout Earth's history. Now, theistic evolutionists interpret the Bible in accordance with their view of evolution. For example, Jesus Christ declares in Mark chapter 10, verse 6, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female." Theistic evolutionists interpret this verse and others like it, such as in Luke 11:50 and Acts chapter 3, verse 21, to support the evolutionary position that the term creation simply means God created the first spark of life and then continually directed his creation through the vehicle of evolution from that first speck to human beings. But that's what the theistic evolutionists, that is their view of creation. While it is true that God is all powerful, so that he could have used evolution, he could have, to generate all species, we contend that he did not employ such an inefficient and often totally ineffective mechanism. If God designed the world to operate according to specific natural laws, requiring minimal interference, why would he use an evolutionary mechanism that would require him to constantly meddle with the development of life? Further, such a mechanism seems an especially cruel method for creating humans, since it involves a survival of the fittest or destruction of the weak and unfit mentality. That gives us a lot to think about in terms of evolution, science, and theistic evolutionists and their view of creation. The proper Christian worldview requires a belief in the Creator as he is literally portrayed in Genesis. A thoughtful reading of Genesis chapter 1 depicts a very literal sounding creation story, although we often hear the word caveat. You can't take Genesis literally. That's what some say. You can't take Genesis literally. Genesis 1 mentions sun, moon, and stars, along with birds in the air and fish in the sea. These physical objects and living creatures are literal. The mention of day, month, and year seem literal in the context of Genesis 1. Adam and Eve are depicted as literal people whose descendants continue through the history of the biblical narrative up to the birth of Jesus Christ. If Adam and Eve were mythical, it would be difficult to determine where myth ends and history begins in the genealogy of the human race. We're going to take this up in our next discussion on Christian worldview versus science.